When Johnny Depp walks into Richard Stanton's podcast studio, the atmosphere crackles with anticipation. The notorious host is known for his brutal takedowns and controversial questions that have ended careers. Tonight's episode has been promoted as The Truth Behind Johnny Depp, promising revelations and confrontations. But as the interview unfolds, something unexpected happens. Johnny remains composed, authentic, and impossible to provoke. By the time the podcast ends, it won't be Johnny struggling for words. It will be Richard. What happens in that studio will leave millions listening, and Richard Stanton will never approach an interview the same way again. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another special story for you. The familiar intro music of the Stanton Files pulsed through the studio, accompanied by flashing red recording lights. The anticipation in the small but exclusive audience was palpable. They were among the lucky few to witness what promised to be the most explosive interview of the year. Richard Stanton was the most feared podcaster in the entertainment industry. His voice reached millions, and his reputation for destroying carefully crafted public images was unmatched. He didn't conduct interviews. He conducted interrogations, meticulously researched to target his guests' most vulnerable points. Tonight's episode had been promoted relentlessly across all platforms. The Johnny Depp interview, no questions, off limits. Social media had been buzzing with speculation for weeks. The studio screens displayed montages of Richard's greatest gotcha moments, celebrities stammering, politicians sweating, influencers breaking down. His signature razor-sharp smile appeared in every clip, eyes gleaming with predatory satisfaction. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer's voice boomed, "please welcome Johnny Depp." The small studio audience erupted into applause. Johnny Depp entered with his characteristic, understated presence. He was dressed in a simple black shirt and vest, his hair slightly tousled, multiple rings adorning his fingers. There was a quiet dignity in his walk, no forced smile, no excessive showmanship. His eyes, deep and observant, took in the studio setup with calm interest. "Johnny, welcome to the Stanton Files." Richard extended his hand, his smile wide but eyes calculating. "Thank you for having me, Richard," Johnny replied, his voice carrying its familiar gentle rasp. The audience applauded again. Richard began with seemingly friendly questions about Johnny's early career, his evolution as an actor, and his approach to iconic roles. Johnny answered thoughtfully, always redirecting praise toward directors, fellow actors, and crew members who had shaped his journey. But then something shifted. Richard leaned back in his chair, his posture changing almost imperceptibly. The warmth in his expression faded, replaced by something more predatory. He glanced at his notes dramatically, the studio lights dimming slightly. "You've had quite the journey, Johnny, but there's something that's been on everyone's mind lately." Johnny remained composed, his gaze steady on Richard, fully aware the real interview was about to begin. "Some say tonight's podcast will finally expose the real Johnny Depp. Are you prepared for that?" A hushed silence fell over the audience. It was as if an invisible duel was about to begin. Johnny tilted his head slightly, his eyes now carrying a deeper intensity beneath their calm surface. "Richard, I wouldn't be sitting here if I wasn't." Richard's smile widened, pleased. He knew he had ammunition that Johnny couldn't possibly anticipate, and The audience had no idea that tonight would not be remembered as the night Johnny Depp was exposed. It would be remembered as the night Richard Stanton made the biggest miscalculation of his career. The studio atmosphere shifted almost tangibly. Richard Stanton adjusted his posture, placing his tablet prominently on the table between them. He had spent years perfecting this approach. Start with softball questions, build false comfort, then strike where it hurts most. Johnny, you've created characters that have become cultural icons. Captain Jack Sparrow, Edward Scissorhands, Willy Wonka, characters that transcend film and become part of our collective imagination. I've been fortunate, Johnny replied simply. Oh, come on, Richard said with a practiced chuckle. We both know it's more than fortune. People have called you one of the most versatile actors of your generation. Your films have grossed billions worldwide. You've been nominated for 3 Academy Awards. The audience applauded enthusiastically. Johnny simply nodded, his expression revealing nothing. Yeah, and throughout your career, you've managed to maintain this mystique, this idea that you're somehow outside the Hollywood system, the rebel who never really conformed. Johnny gave a small smile, almost as if he knew where this was heading. That's very kind of you to say, he replied quietly. Richard leaned in slightly, the warmth in his tone cooling noticeably. But you see, that's what makes this next part so interesting. The audience quieted. You are, without question, one of Hollywood's most beloved actors. But lately, that image has been complicated. Johnny's expression remained calm, but his eyes sharpened almost imperceptibly. Richard glanced at his tablet and then back at Johnny, a slow, calculating smile forming. You've always been very private about certain aspects of your life, but in recent years, that privacy has been, let's say, forcibly removed, the audience murmured, knowing exactly what he was referring to. The lawsuits, the allegations, the public battles, they've all painted a very different picture than the one people have held for decades. Richard tilted his head. Some have suggested that the Johnny Depp they thought they knew never really existed at all. The tension was palpable. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on Richard's every word, waiting for the killing blow. So I have to ask, Richard continued, his voice carrying a note of mock sincerity, who is the real Johnny Depp? The eccentric artist who charms everyone he meets? Or the troubled man behind closed doors that we've heard so much about? The air froze. The audience held its collective breath. Even the crew members behind the cameras exchanged uncomfortable glances. Johnny didn't move. He didn't flinch. His expression remained unchanged. Instead, he did something completely unexpected. He smiled, a small, thoughtful smile that carried no anger, no defensiveness, just a profound calm. Then he looked at Richard, not with hostility, but with curiosity, as if trying to understand what drove a man to build a career on others' discomfort. Johnny took a moment, a long one, letting the weight of Richard's question hang in the air. Richard Stanton had played his first card, but what Johnny would say next would make him realize he had just stepped into territory he wasn't prepared for. The studio was utterly silent. Richard's accusation lingered in the air, but Johnny Depp remained unshaken. He didn't leap to defend himself, didn't show frustration, didn't react with the indignation Richard had expected. Instead, he asked a question that caught everyone off guard. Richard, why do you think people enjoy seeing others in pain. The audience stirred in surprise. This wasn't the defensive reaction they expected. Even Richard was momentarily thrown off balance, his fingers twitching slightly against his tablet. "Excuse me?" he asked, forcing a small laugh. Johnny's expression remained thoughtful, yet unwavering. "I asked why you think people enjoy seeing others in pain. It's a genuine question." The energy in the room shifted, the power dynamic. The very foundation of Richard's strategy began to crumble. He cleared his throat and forced a smile, attempting to regain control. "Johnny, this interview isn't about philosophical musings. It's about you answering some very real questions about your life." Johnny nodded slowly, as if considering Richard's words, then spoke again. "But isn't that the heart of what we're really discussing? This hunger to see someone's pain packaged as entertainment?" Richard's smile faltered. He glanced briefly at his producer off stage, who was already sensing the interview veering away from its planned trajectory. Johnny didn't let up, because if we're honest with ourselves, Richard, this isn't really about finding truth. It's about performance. It's about orchestrating moments of discomfort that can be clipped, shared, commented on. The audience shifted in their seats, captivated. Some nodded in agreement. Richard attempted to cut in. "Well, Johnny, I think what people are really looking for is authenticity." But Johnny didn't allow him to finish. His voice remained calm, but there was an unmistakable depth to it now. "No, what people are being trained to look for is conflict. We've created a world where vulnerability isn't something to be respected. It's something to be exploited. Where healing isn't celebrated, it's questioned. Where complexity is flattened into headlines." Richard opened his mouth to interject, but for perhaps the first time in his career, he hesitated. Johnny leaned slightly forward, his gaze holding Richard's. "Real authenticity, the kind that matters, isn't something you can extract under studio lights for entertainment." The audience erupted in applause. Richard sat frozen. This wasn't how the interview was supposed to go. He was supposed to be leading, setting the tone. But Johnny had done something far more powerful than just defend himself. He had shifted the entire conversation. Now, Richard Stanton found himself in the unfamiliar position of being on the defensive. He needed to regain control quickly, so he did the only thing he could. He pushed harder. "But Johnny," he said, forcing a confident tone, "don't you think the public deserves to know the truth? Isn't it our responsibility as media to question narratives that seem carefully constructed?" Johnny didn't flinch. "Tell me something, Richard," he said quietly. "Who benefits from this question?" Richard blinked. Johnny's expression remained composed, but there was now an unmistakable intensity beneath it. "Is it your audience? Is it the culture at large? Or is it an industry built on turning real human experiences into commodities?" The room was electric. Richard's carefully orchestrated attack had been dismantled with surgical precision. He couldn't let Johnny control the narrative. He had to take back power, and so he made a decision. A risky one, a desperate one. The tension had reached a breaking point. Richard Stanton, a veteran interviewer known for his ruthless tactics, had just been outmaneuvered on his own podcast. He could feel the energy in the room shifting against him. The audience, once eager to see Johnny Depp cornered, was now captivated by his measured responses. Richard needed to act quickly. If he let Johnny maintain control, tomorrow's headlines wouldn't be about him exposing Johnny Depp. They would be about how Johnny Depp had exposed him, so he went for the nuclear option. He forced a laugh, shaking his head as if Johnny's words had been naive. "That's a beautiful sentiment, Johnny. Really, very poetic." Johnny remained still, waiting. "But let's cut through the philosophy. People aren't questioning your public image because they're culturally conditioned. They're questioning it because the contrast is jarring." The audience stirred uncomfortably. Richard pressed forward, sensing a sliver of momentum returning. "For decades, you presented yourself as this gentle, misunderstood artist, the sensitive soul in a brutal industry. But then the court transcripts came out, the text messages, the videos, things that don't align with that carefully crafted image. Some audience members shifted awkwardly in their seats. Others remained completely still, barely breathing. Some people are saying the real Johnny Depp is someone very different from the character you've played for the public all these years, that the whole sensitive artist routine is just that, a routine." Richard's voice took on an edge of satisfaction, thinking he had finally landed a blow that couldn't be deflected. Johnny exhaled slowly, not in frustration or anger, but as if he were simply giving Richard an opportunity to reconsider what he had just said. Richard didn't take it. The audience was silent, waiting. Johnny leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together, his voice dropping to a near whisper that somehow commanded more attention than any shout could. "Tell me, Richard," he said, looking directly into Richard's eyes with a gaze that seemed to penetrate his carefully constructed persona. "What does it feel like?" Richard blinked, momentarily confused. "What does what feel like?" "Well, what does it feel like?" Johnny continued, his voice steady, measured, undeniably powerful, "to build a career on pain, to sit across from another human being and mine their darkest moments for content?" The audience collectively held their breath. Richard froze for the first time in his career, at a complete loss for words. But Johnny wasn't done. "What does it feel like?" he said, his tone now penetrating yet still calm. "To know that your success depends on turning complex human experiences into simple villains and victims." The room was shifting again. Richard could feel it. He had taken a risk, a major one, and now Johnny had turned that risk back on him with devastating precision. "I have to wonder." Johnny let out a small, almost compassionate sigh. "Do you talk about humanity this way because you've forgotten what it means to be human? Or because you never knew in the first place?" The audience exploded into applause. Richard's face tightened. He had lost control completely. Worse, Johnny had just exposed something in him that he had spent years burying beneath his cynical brand of journalism. And for the first time in his career, Richard Stanton wasn't sure if he could recover from what had just happened. The thunderous applause filled the small studio, rolling over Richard Stanton like an unstoppable wave. Johnny Depp had just turned the entire interview on its head, and everyone knew it. Richard, for the first time in his podcast history, felt the weight of silence pressing down on him. When the applause finally faded, his audience was no longer on his side. He forced a tight-lipped smile, struggling to mask his discomfort. This wasn't how the podcast was supposed to unfold. Johnny wasn't supposed to have this level of control. And yet here he was, serene, unshaken, unapologetic. Richard straightened his posture, glancing at his tablet in search of an escape route. But Johnny wasn't finished. He leaned back slightly, his voice still calm but now carrying an unmistakable gravity. "You know, Richard, I've met a lot of interesting people throughout my life. Richard stilled, sensing another shift. I've met directors who can see worlds that don't exist yet. Musicians who can translate emotions into sounds. Writers who build entire universes with just 26 letters. People who create things that change how we see ourselves. Richard forced a nod, unsure where Johnny was heading. But do you know the most remarkable people I've ever met? The audience was silent, hanging on his every word. Richard hesitated before responding. Who? Johnny's voice softened, but his words cut through the air with perfect clarity. The ones who remain kind despite having every reason not to be. A ripple of murmurs swept through the crowd. Richard's throat tightened as Johnny let the words sink in before continuing. Kindness isn't about being soft or naive. It isn't about ignoring the darkness in the world or in ourselves. His eyes locked onto Richard's, and Richard felt the weight of everything he had just tried to do. Real kindness is about seeing the full complexity of someone's humanity and choosing not to weaponize it against them. The studio erupted in applause again. Richard gripped his tablet tighter, trying to maintain his composure. He was losing badly, and everyone could see it. He opened his mouth to speak, but Johnny wasn't done. He lifted a single finger, a small, deliberate gesture that immediately silenced the room. Even Richard stopped breathing. And then, with the precision of a man who had spent years observing the human condition, Johnny delivered his final thought. You called me troubled, Richard. You suggested that my life, my struggles, my journey through addiction and recovery, my mistakes and my attempts to make amends, that all of this somehow makes me less authentic. Richard's face flushed as Johnny continued. But let me ask you something. Who's creating more truth in this world? Someone who acknowledges their brokenness and tries to grow from it? Or someone who turns other people's brokenness into entertainment? A stunned silence filled the studio. Even the producers behind the cameras froze. Johnny tilted his head slightly, studying Richard, not with anger, not with resentment, but with something far more devastating: compassion. Richard Stanton had spent years building a career out of controlling conversations, but tonight, the conversation had completely escaped his grasp. For the first time in his professional life, he realized he had lost not just the interview, but something more fundamental. The air in the studio was different now. Something had shifted irreversibly. Richard Stanton sat across from Johnny Depp, staring at him, but not really seeing him anymore. He was looking at the audience, and what he saw terrified him. The applause had faded, but the energy in the room remained electric. People weren't just watching anymore. They were witnessing. Johnny hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't gotten angry. He hadn't needed to. He had done something far more powerful. He had made authenticity more compelling than controversy. Richard's heart pounded in his chest. He had one last chance to salvage something from this disaster. He had to speak, had to say something, anything, to pull himself out of this spiral. But as soon as he opened his mouth, he realized the truth. There was nothing left to say. The audience, his audience, wasn't waiting for him anymore. They were completely absorbed by Johnny Depp, the man Richard had tried to break down, and who had instead revealed a strength that needed no defense. Richard looked toward the cameras. The red recording lights blinked back at him, mercilessly, capturing his unraveling in real time. Somewhere in the control room, his producers were frantically sending messages, urging him to pivot, to salvage what he could. But it was too late. Johnny had made his final statement, and now he didn't need to say anything more. He simply sat there, his presence alone carrying more weight than any argument, any dramatic monologue could. Richard Stanton, the man who had built an empire on controlling narratives, had just lost control of his own show. And the worst part, he knew it. His hands gripped the arms of his chair, knuckles whitening. He wanted to push back, to challenge Johnny one last time, but he couldn't, because if he did, it wouldn't be a conversation anymore. It would be desperation. And the world was already watching him fall apart. The silence stretched on, unforgiving and unrelenting. And then Johnny did something that made Richard's stomach drop. He smiled. Not a smirk, not a victorious grin, but a gentle, knowing, almost sorrowful smile. The kind of smile a man gives when he's already moved past the fight, when he doesn't even need to win because he already has. And that's when Richard Stanton realized this wasn't his podcast anymore. It never had been. But Richard still had one last card to play. And if he could use it in time, maybe, just maybe, he could change the narrative before it was too late. The silence had done more damage than any words ever could. Richard Stanton sat in his chair, staring at Johnny Depp, realizing too late that he had completely misjudged him. His podcast, the one he controlled, the one where he dictated the rules, was no longer his, and millions of listeners would soon know it. He needed to do something fast. With a forced smile, he turned toward the microphone. "Well, that certainly was an interesting perspective, Johnny," he said, his voice having lost its edge, its confidence, its superiority. Johnny didn't respond. He didn't need to. The damage had already been done. But Richard wasn't finished. He had one last play. If he couldn't win this battle here in the studio, he would take it to social media. Before the podcast had even finished airing, clips had already flooded the internet. On Twitter, the hashtags were trending globally. Johnny Depp, Stanton, Richard Stanton, takedown. The Stanton collapse. The moment of silence, that exact second where Richard had lost control, was being shared everywhere. Some called it the most satisfying moment in podcast history. Others described it as a masterclass in emotional intelligence. One tweet with over 500,000 likes simply read, "Johnny Depp didn't just win that interview, he transcended it." Meanwhile, Richard Stanton was trending for all the wrong reasons. The internet was merciless. People were analyzing his tactics, dissecting how he had tried to manipulate the narrative and how Johnny had dismantled it without breaking a sweat. Reaction videos flooded YouTube. Podcasts dissected the interview that backfired. Even mainstream news outlets picked up the story. The headlines were brutal. Johnny Depp stays dignified while podcast host crumbles. Richard Stanton's worst career mistake caught live. How Johnny Depp turned an attack into a lesson in human dignity. Richard watched in horror as his reputation disintegrated in real time. This wasn't just a bad interview. This was a career-defining catastrophe. And Johnny, he didn't say a word afterward. He didn't post a response, and he didn't do interviews about it. He simply went back to living his life. And somehow that made it even worse for Richard, because Richard Stanton had spent his entire career crafting narratives, controlling headlines, deciding who won and who lost, and in the court of public opinion. But this time, he had lost spectacularly. And Johnny hadn't even needed to fight. The studio was his, the platform was his. But that night, the story belonged to Johnny Depp. Richard Stanton sat alone in his office, staring at his computer screen. The numbers were catastrophic. His podcast, the show he had built from the ground up, the show where he had made a name for himself as the fearless interviewer who could tear down the biggest celebrities, was now a cautionary tale. The ratings had plummeted. Sponsors were rethinking their contracts. And worst of all, his credibility was shattered. He scrolled through the headlines, his stomach twisting with every new article, how Richard Stanton destroyed his own career in 60 minutes, Johnny Depp's masterclass in Grace Under Fire, when gotcha journalism gets got. The internet had already moved on from Johnny's side of the story because Johnny had never played the game. He didn't do a press tour about it. He didn't post a response. He didn't celebrate his victory. Somewhere far from the chaos, Johnny Depp was exactly where he wanted to be, away from the cameras, away from the headlines, away from the people who lived for conflict. He walked through a quiet street, hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, a small, peaceful smile on his lips. Because for him, this was never a battle. It was never about proving a point. It was never about winning. It was about being true to himself. He had always known the truth. The loudest person in the room is rarely the strongest. The strongest person is the one who doesn't need to shout. In his dark office, Richard closed his laptop. The screen blinked off, but the damage was already done. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure where his career was headed. He had spent so much time tearing people down, believing that was power. But Johnny had shown him something else entirely, a different kind of power, a power that came not from destruction, but from authenticity. And deep down, he knew he had never stood a chance against that. In the end, the story wasn't about Johnny Depp being exposed. It wasn't about Richard Stanton getting humiliated. It was about something much bigger. A simple truth. Real strength doesn't come from attacking others. It comes from knowing who you are and refusing to let the world change that. And that was the lesson Richard Stanton would never forget. If you enjoyed this story, we have many more that will warm your heart. Click the screen to explore more stories of hope, compassion, and resilience.